We are now live. So as folks come into the chat, this live would be saved. So I'm just going to continue to talk about what Adornment Story is and why we're here in this live, and the topic of self-care. Right now, self-care is a huge buzzword, and a lot of people are talking about it. There's a lot of wellness influencers. There are a lot of people who are talking about, what it means to take care of yourself. And sometimes that work can be minimized because sometimes we just leave it online and we're not doing the work offline. So this live really is to kind of dive into that and challenge, what self-care is and the conversations about self-care that's happening right now. And Adornment Stories is really great because they intersect wellness and the art and wellness and arts to kind of have these conversations and to kind of talk about these topics and to help Black women and femmes find their truth and discover themselves and really live their best lives, basically, in their creative practices and creative industries. And a little bit about myself. I am in the, I think, second cohort, and I've been working with Adornment Stories for almost a year. And we're basically doing a lot of work on finding ourselves, unpacking, learning about how to take care of ourselves in this artistic journey, because sometimes, we're so protective over the art and not the artist. So Adornment Stories is really great for that. And, there's a bunch of other great women and non-binary folk involved that are really amazing. And I've really been just having a great time sharing and learning and unlearning as well. Hi to those who joined in. As I mentioned before you came on, this is going to be a saved live story, so I'm just going to be continuing the workshop regardless, hoping that it could be accessible for those who didn't join the live immediately. So self-care, redefining self-care and unpacking trauma and transformative healing is the title of the workshop. And some things I want to bring up is what is self-care to you? I think Latoya, Ashley, if you're still there, what does self-care look like to you? And why do we do these self-care practices? In terms of definitions, because I think we all look at it differently, but in terms of a definition, self-care would look like taking an active role in protecting one's own well-being and happiness. Self-care and relationship to self are connected. So, self-care is about physical conditions, awareness, kindness, choices, priorities, community, being able to slow down. It's really whatever it takes to really take care of yourself and to be present in the moment with you. And that's why self-care and relationship to self are so connected, because it really is about paying attention to yourself and paying attention to what you need. Some of my self-care practices are writing. I've been writing since forever, and I didn't really understand why until I grew up and realized that was just a therapeutic release for me. I started doing yoga at a young age as well. Anything to really distract myself and allow me to kind of release. And yoga and writing were that for me. And I started writing poetry, and it was really fun. And I found myself writing about things that hurt me, that bothered me, things I was interested about, things that didn't necessarily happen to me, but I felt like were relevant to talk about because they were important issues, like sexual assault or certain experiences with mothers and fathers. I would write about so many different topics, whether I lived with that experience or not. That's because I knew a lot of people who did. So I was surrounded by folks who were experiencing traumatic experiences or just painful circumstances. So something I want to kind of dive in is the dangers of commercialized self-care practices, because as much as this is a really important topic, as I mentioned in the very beginning, sometimes we don't always continue the work, right? We look at self-care as this one-day event opposed to a long-term journey, which I find self-care is. And I feel like it's important that we're every day striving to the relationship with self, and that's why self-care is necessary and why it's important. So some of the dangers of self-care we see on TV aren't useful because they only provide temporary relief and instant gratification, such as lighting a candle or sage or having a bubble bath or positive psychology, which are all things I indulge in. You know, I love bubble baths. You know, I love putting a face mask on. I love lighting a candle. I love being surrounded by scents, right? But also an important question is, what do we do after we light that candle? What do we do after we, you know, soak ourselves in that bubble bath? And that's why commercialized self-care can be dangerous, is because sometimes we're not offered the tools to finish the work after we've, you know, let go of that temporary pain. You know what I mean? We've got that temporary relief. What do we do next? You know, there's also an illusion that self-care practices are one size fits all. So there's a lot of talk from wellness influencers who kind of give advice on like, this is what you should do when you're sad, this is what you do when you're upset, this is what you should do when you're having these issues, but it doesn't work for everybody. And that's something really important to address when we're talking about self-care, because self-care practices are very unique, and what may work for me might not work for you. And that's really important to recognize. There's a lot of pressure to follow these mainstream self-care practices, and when they don't work for us, there's this shame that gets attached, like, what is wrong with me? Am I doing something wrong? You know, if I tried lighting the candle, it didn't work. If I tried burning sage and it didn't work, does that mean I am broken? And you're not broken. And I think there's this pressure, you know, from these mainstream self-care practices to follow them and feel like everything is going to just be fixed after, and that's not necessarily what happens. And that again goes back to the dangers of commercialized self-care practices, because we don't continue the work after we've gotten our temporary relief. We are not continuing the work, which is important to self-care. You know, self-care is the practice of taking action to preserve or improve one's health. You know, for the last 2 years, as I mentioned, it was a huge buzzword, and there's thousands of advocates that exist to promote radical self-care. And this can be a great thing, but we cannot talk about self-care, health, and wellness without talking about accessibility. I feel like not everyone's self-care practice is accessible. And I'm going to use myself as an example because I feel like it's relevant and I want to speak from my own experience. You know, growing up and doing yoga, it was really expensive, but I just did it anyway. I was lucky enough that once I started university, I got a student discount. But I recognize that it's still really expensive and it's still really inaccessible for a lot of people. And that's why people don't want to try yoga. And not only beyond the inaccessibility of it, sometimes it's not a positive space. You know, I had to be surrounded by a lot of non-Black folks for majority of the time. And it's not that I was not okay with it, but there are times I wish I saw myself in these self-care practices, in these spaces, in these community, you know, meetings and get-togethers. But I hardly saw people like me. And I think that's one reason why folks will choose not to do something, because they don't, one, see themselves in it, two, it's inaccessible, or three, they don't feel like it's a supportive or welcoming space. And I think yoga is a great example of that. As much as I love it and I advocate for it, it's also important to recognize those barriers for other people and to not shame them for not wanting to try something that makes them feel excluded. You know, not only has it been commercialized and commodified to target a particular demographic, it often excludes women of color of the conversation. Like for me, growing up, doing things to make myself feel good were kind of like these whitewashed practices. So whether it was yoga, whether it was writing or meditating, they weren't normalized in, you know, Black communities. And I think the same issue exists for communities of color. But a lot of the time, again, there's this stigma and like, why are you doing this? And like, you know, you don't need to do all these things to feel better. You just feel better. And that kind of goes into a whole other conversation about, you know, health in, you know, communities of color and how we navigate health and how we don't often really consider the issues that we're facing. We kind of just brush it off. You know, we drink tea, we drink ginger ale, and, you know, we laugh it off. Like, laugh is a huge medicine for, you know, families that are Black. You know, we laugh things off, we joke things off. So when we are actually indulging in self-care practices, it's kind of like, why is she doing that? That's kind of weird. That's kind of different. And again, that puts stigma and it makes you feel outcasted. So how can we deepen our self-care practices? So we've talked about a lot so far. We've talked about, you know, the fact that self-care could be stigmatized, it could be inaccessible, it can make people feel excluded. it isn't always something that could really make you feel better, right? And it go again, like I'm gonna use the example of a bubble bath. Like it doesn't always do something for me, you know. It might make me a little bit more relaxed, but it doesn't really take away what happened the day before, right? So where we're gonna dive into now is how can we deepen that, and how can we go further with our self-care practices. And for me, something I realized is that taking care of yourself isn't meant to be just held on Sundays. It's a daily, everyday practice. It's kind of like, for me, I remember growing up and seeing my mom and my aunties always leaving the cleaning to a Sunday, which is something I've adopted too, because I like to leave cleaning to a Sunday. But we shouldn't do that when it comes to self-care. We can't just dump everything to Sunday. You know what I mean? It's something that we have to be consistent with, because that's how we elevate ourselves, and that's how we truly take care of ourselves, when we're doing practices a little bit more consistently, opposed to just one day of the week, because so much happens in a day, so much happens every day. So it's really important that we make ourselves feel good long term. So how can we make ourselves feel good long term? So that can look like identifying the pain in your life that is difficult to open up about, you know, sharing, apologizing, holding others accountable, showing up for yourself, and making time for radical healing. Radical healing is really, really hard. And a lot of the time when you hear self-care, we don't talk about healing. And I think those two go hand in hand, are so, so important, because self-care is all about healing. And sometimes when we think about healing, we think about something that was so, it has to be something super large scale, right? And I think healing is for everything, right? Healing is like, you know, stubbing your toe. You know, you have to heal your toe. It's like getting a cut and putting on the Band-Aid. You're putting on the Band-Aid to ease the healing, right? So healing isn't always for these large scale things, but it's important to heal from the large scale things too. I think healing is for everybody, and we need to normalize those conversations and on how we can heal, and how we could unpack the things that we've went through, and unpack the traumatic experiences. And some of the things that I've done to help myself in my healing journey is really expressing myself, which is hard, because, you know, we grow up kind of not wanting people to know the things that we experienced because of the shame that's attached. You know, like I didn't want people to know how much I didn't love my skin. I didn't want people to know that, you know, I was insecure. I didn't want people to know that, you know, I'm imperfect, because there's always this constant battle to prove people wrong. There's always this battle to let people know that I am resilient, I am strong, I am independent, all these things. But realistically, we're not all the time. And I think that's okay. But how can we navigate that? How do we start the conversation? How do we start telling folks that it's okay to go through things and to live through them and to let that flow? Because a lot of time we're rushing through what happened. So like we'll talk about, well, this happened yesterday and that happened and that's it. You know what I mean? But how did it make you feel? How are we going to address it? How are we going to combat it for when it happens the next time? How are we actually making space for healing and peace in our life when traumatic experiences happen? And for me, peace over everything else. And sometimes we're willing to slip things under the rug and just let things slide. But that's how we disrupt our peace, and that's how we let things build up, because we're not putting our peace first. And for me, I've learned that I have to confront. I'm a confrontational person. I know not everybody is, and I'm not gonna put that as my advice to be more confrontational. But for me, it has helped me. That is my self-care practice. When I know I am going through something, I know someone has hurted me or harmed me, whether it was intentionally or not, I feel like I have to confront the person and let them know, like, hey, that actually hurt me. I'll be good, but I need to let you know that it still hurt me. And I think even that in itself is healing, because it's holding somebody else accountable. It's being able to express yourself and identify the issue, and to really maybe get the support from the person who hurt you. And even if you don't get the support from the person who hurt you, you're able to support yourself because you confronted the situation. So how can we find those consistent practices, you know, that contribute to our well-being when they're inconvenient sometimes? Well, let's talk about trauma. I think trauma is what kind of stops us from going into those consistent practices, because it's inconvenient. No one wants to talk about how painful that thing was at 5 years old. No one wants to talk about that painful thing yesterday, because it makes us feel like an inconvenience. It makes us feel like a burden. It makes us feel like we don't know how to do things right. we feel like we're complaining. But trauma is a real thing, and it's often something that we don't address. And that's kind of what builds up to this really awful dump of emotions. You know what I mean? We are not we're not expressing ourselves in healthy ways because we're not addressing the trauma, right? So on one hand, the emotions are valid and we need to make space for those emotions. But when they build up so extremely, it ends up being unhealthy ways of expression. And that's where conflict arises because we're not addressing the trauma. So we're then projecting and we're then blaming and we're then hurting people, and we don't actually want to. There are three main types of trauma: acute, which is like a single incident; chronic, which is repetitive and occurs over an extended period of time; and complex, multiple traumatic experiences that are repetitive and persistent. And, after living through these traumatic experiences, every day we kind of experience triggers. They exist and we can't control them, whether it's a smell, a sound, someone saying something. That's kind of what elicits those traumatic experiences, and that's where the responses come from. So a trigger is something that brings you back to the original event of the trauma. They're very personal, different things trigger different people, and they could be activated through our senses, like I mentioned. And the effects may be short-term or long-term. So I could be triggered and not really feel anything today, but maybe 5 days from now I'm like, fuck, that was a lot, Or someone could be triggered in a moment and that is completely setting their day off. They don't want to do anything. They've lost control over the day. And it's just really an overwhelming experience, right? And it could be really hard. So I'm going to pause for a minute just because that's a lot of content. I see some folks joining in and it could be pretty heavy to talk about. So we're just going to take a minute to just breathe. Yeah, can we do that? So what do we do with this trauma? Something that is also a buzzword, but a helpful buzzword that's been talked about in the mental health community is unpacking. Something that has changed my life, and I didn't really understand what it means. So what does it mean to unpack? In an effort to maintain health, both your psyche and your body develop certain frames or reference or adaptations. So the trauma is buried deep into your being and you are unable to continue to grow. So because we don't unpack, because we're not addressing or identifying these experiences that have made us feel things, we're kind of harboring these emotions and we're not allowing ourselves to grow. We're not allowing ourselves to elevate. So in that sense, we're becoming stagnant. And we're kind of burying ourselves in pain because we're not allowing their room. We're not moving the dirt aside. We're not letting anything kind of like rise above or like grow. So when you unpack, it allows you to release and let go of past or ongoing traumatic, painful experiences to ultimately enhance your well-being. Unpacking is a unique way of deeper healing. When I think of unpacking, I think of really unapologetically, being able to unravel the parts of me that have been heavy. It's kind of like taking off your bra after a long day from work or school or whatever. It's kind of the same thing, but with experiences. Like we take off the bra because it's like a release of, holding things up on our breast. And unpacking is kind of like releasing all the things that have been heavy on our back, if that makes sense. So unpacking is really helpful and it gives you the same kind of relief as like taking off a bra, but actually better. I feel like way better. So what can unpacking trauma look like? It could be noticing and checking harmful behavior that grew out of trauma. It could be journaling, something that I do, writing down those feelings that come from traumatic events or about the event itself, tracking triggers. So tracking triggers like being able to identify when it has happened. That's not always easy and it can be difficult, but being able to track triggers can be also helpful. And talking it out, whether with someone who is an accountability partner or a support system or a professional. And I want to go back to the, inaccessible aspect of self-care because, again, not everyone has access to professional or a therapist, a counselor, So, again, there's stigma, there's shame because we can't afford it. We don't always see professionals that look like us. They don't always understand our experiences as minorities who live in poverty or have experienced, just very deeper things within the Black community. A lot of folks just don't understand. So talking to a professional who doesn't have that same experience can be hard. And that's why a lot of people will choose not to go that route. However, it's still an option, and it's still a really amazing tool. I went to therapy and I found it extremely helpful. Disclaimer, my therapist was white, but she was an amazing white woman. She was great. I felt like it really allowed me to unpack. It felt like it allowed me to become more in tune with myself and the things that I am harboring inside of me, because there are a lot of things that hurt me but I just don't mention, because I feel like I always have to have my big girl shoes on. I always have to just go forward, move forward, and not really be upset about things, because if I'm upset, what am I? Angry Black girl, right? So I've kind of gone through a lot of things that I've just been hush about. So when I started seeing my therapist, I was just talking a storm and letting her know, well, this person did that to me 5 years ago. That person did this to me yesterday, last week. I remember this. It was such a therapeutic release. It was amazing. And I remember, telling folks and other people around me, how much I recommended therapy. But also I recognized that I might not share the same experience as others. A lot of people might have bad experiences with therapy, and I don't blame them, again, because of the things that we've continued to talk about, whether it's inaccessibility or whether it's just not being matched with someone who really understands. Those are all real and valid things. So if you don't want to see a professional, that's fine, but find the self-care practices that work for you. And that goes, again, back to the beginning of the workshop. All of our self-care practices are unique because we are different, and we all want to be loved and served differently. So our self-care practices naturally will just look different, and what works for me might not work for you, and vice versa. So aftercare. So again, something else that I feel like isn't talked about in commercialized self-care conversations is what do we do after? Because sometimes when we are told to unpack, talk about all these emotions, cry, let it out, release, it's what do we do after that? I've cried, but what am I doing to kind of repair myself? And those could be overwhelming emotions and feelings. I remember sometimes just crying and not really knowing what to do next, because I know that crying is good for me. I know unpacking is good for me. I know talking is good for me, but that could also evoke so much emotion. And we need to make sure that we are preparing ourselves and, providing an aftercare that could allow us to kind of slowly let go of the emotion, because the emotion is so there, it's so strong, right? So how can we kind of let that die down a bit? Because even healing exercises, even intentional healing work, it could be painful. This work is not easy. This work is not meant to be comfortable. Unpacking, talking about self-care, doing all the necessary work is hard and sometimes sad, because you're forced to think about things that have harmed you in devastating ways, and you're forced to really go back to certain experiences, and that's not always easy. And I know a lot of people kind of look at ooh, she's getting her shit together, she's all about self-care, she's really doing the damn thing. But people need to understand that doing the damn thing is also hard. It's also triggering, it's also painful, because you're reliving so much emotion, you're reliving so much hardship and pain. So we need to take care of ourselves after the hard work. So for me, I feel like some things that work for me is sleeping. Setting aside time for self-soothing after, checking with myself. Am I okay? What do I need right now? How can I rest? How can I take a break? How can I pause? For me, it's all about slowing down, because when you're living in an emotion, things are kind of happening really fast. You're getting taken back fast. The emotions are spilling fast. The speech is spilling fast. You're kind of unraveling. So for me, the aftercare is all about soothing down. Sorry, my hair was on my mic. I'm going to just repeat that last point. So for me, aftercare looks like soothing down, taking time to slow down, taking time to really let the emotions go. Because as I mentioned, when you're living in that emotion, everything is kind of happening really fast. So you're spilling the emotion, your speech is coming out really fast, you're being brought back really fast to old experiences. So for me, it's all about pausing, it's all about slowing down, and that's how I aftercare. Another method that you could do is writing things down. What just happened right now? Reflecting, what has happened? What am I going to do next? And that's all going to look different for everybody. What I do next is going to be different. What you do next is different. And notice if you're not ready. That's something that we just don't talk about. And I'm a huge advocate for not pushing people to talk about things when they're not ready. You know what I mean? So it goes back to the unpacking things. Not everyone's ready for that. Going to see a professional, not everybody's ready for that. Some people just want to do the face mask and call it a day, and that is fine. Some people just want to go into the bath and call it a day, and that is great. I think we need to let other people have autonomy over their own lives and be able to choose when they're ready to deal with things. And just be a support person for when they are ready to unpack, when they are ready to strengthen, their healthcare practices, when they are ready to kind of talk about what's going on in their life. That's when we lend a hand. That's when we support them. We don't support people or help them when they're not asking for our help, And I feel like that's something that can cause a lot of conflict when we're actively trying to fix people when it's their job. And something I've learned in my life is that nobody's the answer but ourselves, right? We might have all this knowledge, we might know what's best for somebody, we might know all the right tools for them to get better, but only they can do that for themselves. And that's why self-care is in a relationship with yourself. It's not a relationship with others, it's a relationship with yourself. Those two just go hand in hand, and it's important that we support people as they support themselves. So if they're not ready, let them not be ready. Let them not be ready, and understand that that's okay. And for the folks who aren't ready, you need to understand that it's okay if you're not ready, because everyone's self-care practice is just going to look different. Something also important to note is that our healing journey or journeys are not linear. So things aren't always going to be easy peachy. It's not always going to be this straight line. There's going to be so many curves, dips, runs, walks. Like, it's going to be all over the place. It's going to be a mess. That's also okay, and that's also valid. And I know from my healing journey, it's a mess. And there are days where I'm just like not ready, and there are days where I'm very eager, because I know it's something's been sitting on me for a while. So I'm like, okay, I'm ready to do this. And other days I'm like, I am not ready to do this. This is way too much for me. This is overwhelming. I don't want to do this right now. And I've accepted that, and I've stopped pushing myself to be ready to talk about something that I'm clearly not ready to get myself into. So how can we redefine self-care that looks and feels good for you? So understand that self-care won't always be that simple or feel that easy. Our bodies are different. Honor that. What feels good today might feel bad tomorrow. Take your time and do not compare your journey with other people. That's the biggest thing for me. I stopped comparing how I heal to other people because I just need to do things that work for me. And I also understand that things take time, and everybody's just on their own level. Respect that, understand that. Don't be mad about that. Don't be jealous or envious. Let people grow at the pace they want to grow, and you need to grow at the pace that you're going to grow at. That's so important to acknowledge. Comparison will kill you. Comparison will derail you. So as we redefine self-care that looks good for us, remember not to compare where you're at in life with other people. It's okay to rest. Huge, huge, huge. As you do this work, as you be intentional about self-care and healing and, taking care of your health, understand that it's not by force. There are days where you can rest. There are days where you could take a break and pause, and not have to really dive deep into that hard work. It's okay to try something different. For example, like as much as writing has been amazing for me, there are days where I go to different measures. There's days I just want to roller skate. There's days I just want to sleep. There's days I'll do yoga. There's days where I'll call a friend. Understand that you will change, and so will your self-care practices, and that's okay. Do what works for you, because your well-being is way too important to put it on the back burner. Do not put your self-care on the back burner. Pay attention to when you need to step away. Pay attention to when you need to walk out. Pay attention when you need to go back home and reflect. when you're feeling uncomfortable, when you're feeling like this is not for you, pay attention to that. Don't just put things under the rug. Don't just slip it there. Don't just be hush. Don't go mute for anybody. When you know that something is sitting on your chest and you're ready to let that shit fly, let it fly. Speak it, speak your piece, because that is so important. Do not put your self-care on the back burner, period. So that concludes the end of the workshop. I see some folks have joined in. I really enjoyed this session and talking about this because I'm very passionate about it. And for those who are in the chat, I would love to hear, what are your self-care practices and what are some things that you learned, in this session? What are some things you unlearned? What are some things that you enjoyed? I'd love to start a conversation before we've wrapped up. Rest is spiritual, 100% agreed. Someone said, real, amazing. Yes, agreed. Something I unlearned that I want to share is that I think I mentioned this before, but I don't have to do this work every day. Yes, this is a consistent journey and self-care should be consistent, but understanding that I don't actually have to do all this hard emotional labor all the time, because I think sometimes we put this pressure on ourselves to always have it together. And there's days I'm not gonna have it together. So that's something I unlearned about myself. I really don't have to be perfect or I don't always have to be wise. I don't always have to make the right decision. I don't always have to, just have my shit together. I can rest, I could chill. And it's okay if I don't wanna dive into that hard emotional labor sometimes. Comparison is the thief of joy, 100%. Yes. Love the no on comparison. Yeah, that was huge for me too, especially with all these buzzwords and people talking about self-care and mental health. We're quick to see what other people are doing for inspiration, but then we often end up comparing, and that's not good. Also, I'm super avoidant as a coping mechanism, I guess. Ooh, that's real. That was me when I was a teenager. Now I'm the most confrontational person you'll ever meet. But as a teenager, I did not want to talk about shit because I'm like, I don't want people to know I'm mad. I don't want to be the mad or angry black girl. I don't want people to know I'm bothered. Now I'll let you know I'm bothered. I'll let you know. And it's just super important that we address things that don't feel right with us. We owe that to ourselves. So I'm glad that, you're acknowledging that, you're recognizing that, because that's the first step in making that change. Spiritual showers, incest, sage, smudging is a great self-care practice for me. Amazing, yeah. I was just telling a friend, showers, when I'm not feeling good, I just put that temperature up to high. I love hot showers, yeah. And I love being able to just get away from the world. Music is huge for me too. I have multiple playlists for different things. I encourage everyone to do the same. Have different playlists for different things, I have my playlist for when I'm feeling myself, my playlist for when I'm sad, my playlist when I'm fake heartbroken. Playlists are great. Love it. Yeah, these are some great comments. And before we close, I just want to thank Tanya and the rest of the Adornment Stories team. They're the ones who've put all of this together and who are really doing the integral work of amplifying the voices of Black women and femmes and really being a safe space for women to find themselves. Sometimes finding yourself isn't a journey we want to do alone. Although it's important to be able to do these things alone, having a community is just as helpful. I feel like having a community that supports you and uplifts you is just amazing, and really helps me a lot. And it also helps me to learn about so many different perspectives and experiences. Our group meetings have been so inspiring and empowering. And I feel like for those who don't have a support system or have a community, find your tribe, find your people. I know it's not always easy. It's so much easier said than done. Yes, this is supposed to be a personal journey, and 100% this is about your relationship with yourself. But having people who really root for you is key too, 100%. So I encourage y'all to find your people, to be honest with your people. Let your folks hold you accountable and hold yourself accountable. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this workshop about redefining self-care. I hope y'all have learned a little bit about unpacking, a little bit about deepening self-care and why commercialized self-care can be dangerous, and how we can deepen and further our self-care practices. Bye.